So I'm Amanda Donahue, and I'm here with Kaylee Zango, the videographer, and we're here for the LGBT Center of Central Pennsylvania to interview Deb Fulham-Winston. Fulham-Winston.
Right.
Nice to meet you, Deb.
And it's very nice to meet you both.
All right, and just for the sake of, if you could just consent, like verbally consent that you're okay with it.
Yes, I'm totally okay. I'm totally okay with the videography and the videotaping and everything else. Recording.
Right. And just to let you know, if there is any time where you want to stop interviewing or turn the camera off, you just say that. Or if you don't want to answer a question, you can just say, shut up or whatever you want. So
Never.
All right. So let's just start off with early history, where you were born, where you grew up, family.
Okay. Well, I was born in 1952 in February in Boston. I have 8 brothers and sisters and was raised in a very conservative Irish Catholic family, which comes into play later. I went to a Catholic elementary school, and then in 7th grade went to the public school. 7 through 12 went through the public schools. Was very involved in sports when I was in high school. It was pre-Title IX, so the differences between men and women's sports was massive. In fact, we basically got no support. It was very much gym class oriented, not competitive oriented. So it was a very different world. Thank goodness that has changed. I went to Bates College for 2 years up in Maine, and then I did my last 2 years of my BA at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts, where I was one of the first 13 women to graduate from the college. They had been a male-only college for 220 years or somewhat. I mean, no, that can't be right. 120 years. So it was a fascinating experience.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It really was. Then 2 weeks after graduation, I got married, moved to Wisconsin, lived there for 5 years, spent a school year in Italy, then back to Wisconsin, then to here. Since that time, I've primarily done nonprofit work and primarily in development. So any kinds of fundraising, donor relations, that kind of thing. For a 2-year college, a 4-year college, a law school, an aid service organization, Planned Parenthood, a hospice organization, public television, and a community foundation. And now I've started my own business doing freelance grant writing. So, a little bit of everything.
Yeah, really amazing.
And I have two children who are both in their mid to late 20s.
Okay. So you just flew through a lot of these. Well, okay, backtrack a little bit. So you said that your family was Irish Catholic?
Yes.
So do you want to talk a little bit about that, about like what that entailed and maybe how that played into your own religious beliefs?
Well, I left early on, starting about when I was 12. I decided this was not something that I was interested in doing. There was very little about the Catholic Church that was attractive as a female person. So that I have not been a member of a faith community voluntarily since I was about 13. But while I lived at home, it was my parents' house, their rules, so you play by the rules. I don't have any religious convictions. I have ethical convictions, but I'm not affiliated in any way, shape, or form with any kind of organized religion, nor do I really actually believe that there's any kind of deity or afterlife or anything else, which was diametrically opposed to my parents. But I just realized recently, of the 7 of my siblings who are still alive, only 1 goes to church regularly and 1 goes occasionally. And that's it. So we all pretty much sort of went our separate ways. But I think it has a big impact on how you approach the world to be raised in that kind of codified environment. Because of the fact that it was not only at home, I also K through 6, I was in a Catholic elementary school when there were still nuns teaching. I never had anything other than nuns teach me when I was a kid. It really changes the way that you look at things, and certainly hierarchies you learn them very quickly and you understand how they work very quickly, which that's actually pretty handy. I never got caught for anything in high school. So But it does, I think it does shape your worldview to come out of something like that. But I think also that there were 6 girls and 3 boys, and it was a very male-centered household. And so I think very early on I realized that things are not so good for women out there. So became a feminist fairly early on as well. But when I took my job with Planned Parenthood, at that time, it was in 2004, I think it was. When I told my best friend about the fact that I got the job, she was like, "Thank God your parents are dead." Because that would have like totally put them over the edge. Wow. They had a hard enough time when I worked for SCAN. Mm-hmm. That was very hard for them because my mother believed that homosexuality was a disease from which someone could be cured. And I think my father had just never become comfortable with the concept or just the reality. And I'm sure he encountered folks over the years who were gay, but you didn't talk about it. You never talked about it. And in those early days, people could very easily say, "I don't know anybody who's gay," because people were so far in the closet that, of course, they knew people who were gay, but they didn't know that. So they could very honestly say, "Geez, sort of nobody in my world is gay. That's those people in New York and San Francisco and Boston and big cities. They don't exist other than that." So it does change your worldview, I think, to be raised that way. But I left that behind pretty early on.
Definitely. So you mentioned that you became a feminist early on. So how do you think that has affected, I mean, even just from what you've said already, it sounds like it's affected a lot of what you've chosen to do throughout your life.
Well, yeah, I think it has. I don't know that I would have made the choices to work at the places. Certainly I would not have worked at SCAN or Planned Parenthood without that in my past, I don't think. But I think it also had an impact. For instance, I worked at Dickinson for 6 years in the development office, mainly working with alumni, because I was doing annual giving, and then I was doing class chairmans and the class giving committees and that kind of thing for reunions. So working with those women and really encouraging them to be active participants and to take their role seriously. That it was, and not always have committees be led by men. That there's place for everybody. Yeah. But that things have changed so dramatically in the last 20 years, which is really good, 30 years, which is really wonderful. When I first started out, it was very, very, very common to be treated, even though I was a professional staff person, people sort of assumed you were a secretary. Of course, secretaries don't really exist anymore. So an administrative assistant, that you were not a professional person. And there was also a tendency for men to basically try to pat you on the head. It's very difficult to deal with in a way that is not rude. Yeah. Because they didn't get it. They just didn't get it. That they weren't, the notion of treating women equally in the workplace was so new for many of them that they never really got there. And it's still true, but it's less true because there's so many more men who have come up assuming that they will be working with women. It would never occur to them that they would be in an all-male environment, even in the military, which was probably, I can't think of any, well, other than the seminary, I can't think of any other place that's really just sort of all men or a preponderance of men anymore, which is good. Football, yeah, there is that. But that could be changing too, with all that's going on there. There was some off topic. Never mind.
I actually think I know. There was a woman who just got a scholarship for football.
Oh, nice. Is she a kicker?
Scholarship. I don't know. I don't really hear anything more about that though.
That would seem the likely first place. But what I was going to say was I recently heard on a news report, a little short thing done by a gentleman who had for years been very, very involved in midget football as a senior kind of organizing person nationally. And he was saying kids under 12 should never be playing football.
Oh, wow.
Absolutely should not, because of the damage to their bodies and possibly their brains. And that by the time you're 12, a lot of your structure is kind of set, or at least stronger. But with those little guys, he was like, absolutely not. It shouldn't be happening. I was like, whoa, that's fascinating. that's so different. I mean, 5 years ago, no one would say that out loud. So it's one of those positive changes that kind of sneaks in when you're not paying attention, because for somebody that integral to the
Yeah, for sure.
mission, essentially, to say, this shouldn't be happening, is very different. It's kind of exciting now, I think.
That is exciting.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So, well, let's talk about what you primarily came here to talk about. SCAN. So, what time did you start getting involved?
Okay. I first became aware of SCAN because I was looking for a job. And it was actually the first job, I was looking for a job after having been out of the workforce for 2 years, first living in England for 2 years, where my first son was born, and then coming back into this country, and 4 months later my younger son was born. So I had been out of the workforce for about 4 years. And I was starting to look for a job, and the market was not great. And it was also, there's a certain amount of lack of, I mean, you've been out of the workforce, it's like, who's going to hire me? I've been, so what have you been doing for the last 4 years? Well, I've been diapering babies. Not much else. And parenting. But it's a little intimidating when you first start doing that. So I had been applying, and it was also the time of year, it was sort of January, and so that's not a huge time for people to hire anyway. But I saw this in the newspaper, because in those days, that's where you went to look for a job, because everything was still hard copy. It was, want ads were in the newspaper, and they're really, I don't think, that would have been 2000, that would have been 1992, January of 92. I don't think anything was electronic at that point. It's kind of hard to remember, but I don't think so in terms of public media. Or if it was very low-key and small. So looking at the newspaper and saw that, and so I sent in my application, and then this being a very small valley, the gentleman who was then chair of the board had been a Dickinson student, and actually had been a student of my husband's, and had been very involved with student stuff when I was working for Dickinson, so I had met him then. His name was Jim Cartmel, and I'm guessing Jim graduated maybe like 89, 88, somewhere in there. I'm not sure exactly. And he was working for maybe Capital Blue Cross, somebody big, health insurance, I think. So that was sort of welcoming and like, whoa. And so after a series of interviews with the executive director and then with the board, they hired me. And I was just absolutely elated. I was also, I don't know if I was the most naive person on the planet at that point, but I was one of the most naive people on the planet when it came to homophobia, because it never occurred to me that this would be an issue. These are, SCAN was taking care of people who were sick. Cancer Society, Heart Association, leukemia and lymphoma. I mean, it's somebody sick, you figure out a way to take care of them. So then I called my parents and my mother-in-law to tell them about my new job, and I was very excited. And my mother had the A answer, and she said, whatever makes you happy makes me happy. It's like, okay, not overwhelming, but that's okay. And then I was talking to my dad, and his comment was, I never thought you'd work at a place like that. Not a great answer. Then I told my mother-in-law, and her comment was, don't bring anything home. The C answer, or perhaps the F answer. I was almost in tears by the time I got through telling them. And this was what I didn't know at the time was this was the first reaction that was going to become more common. And more often than not, when I told people other than my close friends about the job that I had taken, they were like, why are you working there? And it's like, well, because they'll pay me. That seems like a really good plan. And it's a nonprofit, and I wanted to work for a nonprofit. And I liked the people I had met because they were delightful. It took several months before I realized sort of what I had done. which was being a very, and the other thing that sort of brought this to mind, I'd say I was at SCAN for about a week when one of our volunteers popped his head into my office and he asked me the same question. He's like, why are you working here? And I looked at him and I said, because they pay me. And he was like, okay, that's fine. And my sense was that what he was trying to find out was whether or not I was your basic suburban white woman, bleeding heart liberal who had come here to take care of the innocent victims. But without saying that. Though that came up later with other things. But it became clear really early on that I had completely and utterly underestimated the level of homophobia and fear that people had about gay people, drug users, HIV, AIDS, sort of, is it catching, is it in the air, can you shake hands with somebody and get it, whatever, sort of what kind of contact. I mean, most people were so stunningly ignorant, including myself, about sort of transmission, what is this really, how does this affect people? We just didn't know, and we were all on a massive learning curve along with the NIH and everybody else because people didn't know anything. They didn't know how to treat it. They didn't know how to do things with it. So it was a kind of a crazy transition over time. It got to the point that I would regularly meet people in business situations where they would not shake my hand, where they would move away from me and like literally, physically sort of move back from me. I can still remember going to a training session that was being put on by one of the nonprofits in the area about fundraising, and it was free. So my executive director at that time, Peg Durkers, and Jim Cartmell, who was our board chair, and I all went to see, because it was also a way to meet funders as well. So we thought that would be useful. And Jim had a cold. So he was a little sneezy, coughing. And people, no one would sit near him. No one would shake his hand. No one would talk to him. People physically moved away from him when he coughed or sneezed. Like somehow, I mean, we used to tease in the office that there were AIDS cooties and what was going to happen is somebody was going to catch them from us. But it was, and we could laugh about it, but it was actually really serious. I mean, the level of disconnect between the general public and anybody working in the area was massive. And talking to reporters, they didn't know what the hell they were talking about and would ask monumentally stupid questions about everything. And there was a huge amount of, I don't know if it was really misinformation or just complete ignorance that had an impact on everyone because they just didn't know. So I was hired as the first development person. Before that, everything had been volunteers. And the organization originally had been all volunteers, and so Peg was the first executive director, and there were caseworkers, and SCAN was also the home of the Pennsylvania AIDS Hotline. So that person lived in our office as well, even though she wasn't on our payroll, she was on the state's payroll. That's where she was there when we were there. I'm trying to think, is that everybody? Oh, we had an education person as well. Who was mainly doing street outreach to people, trying to get people to come in and talk to us, people to seek out services. She had hoped to be able to start a clean needle program, but needle exchange was anathema at that point. So handing out a lot of condoms, handing out a lot of booklets, information, that kind of thing. And she had a group of volunteers who did street work with her as well. So we were a pretty small group. So I'm guessing, I'd have to go back and think, but I think there were 4 caseworkers, the hotline person, the education person, me, Peg, a receptionist, and a part-time bookkeeper. And I think that was everybody. And then we had a bootload of volunteers, many of whom would come in and out at odd times because some of them were on disability, so they weren't working, so they would come in and stuff envelopes and make photocopies and get the street packets ready for people, which were little plastic bags, little Ziploc bags, and there was like a condom, a sterile wipe, what else was in there? Lube, seems to me there was something else in there as well, and maybe a booklet. of some kind, so that because we handed out hundreds of these things to people. I mean, I didn't, but the street folks, those folks did. And other than that, I mean, during the day, we basically operated as any nonprofit operated. The caseworkers were seeing clients. I was mainly in charge of the AIDS walk, organizing the AIDS walk. And then we had another, that was in the fall. And then, is that right? Or was it in the spring? I can't even remember now. No, it must have been the fall, because spring we had something called Caring a la carte, which was a dining program where restaurants would agree to give X% of the profit to the organization, and people would host tables. So like I would recruit a group of people to come to a particular restaurant with me, and we'd all sit together, and then that was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But there were very few restaurants who were willing to talk to us. And in fact, several years later, when I moved on to my next job, one of the first things I realized was that people returned my phone calls when I worked for a community college much faster than when I worked for SCAN. So it was just a crazy time. And of course, it was also, I was working there before the triple cocktail came out. So there was pretty much AZT, and there was another DD something. I can't remember what the other med was. But it meant that people were dying. And some people died very fast. Some people, it was a much longer trajectory. Some people lived long enough so that by the time the triple cocktail came, they got their lives back. But we literally watched people disappear because they would get smaller and smaller and thinner. And then all of a sudden they wouldn't be coming in anymore because they couldn't get out of bed or because they had died. And it was, I don't know how the caseworkers did it, to be honest with you, because they became very close to the clients. The folks I knew were the folks who were our volunteers. So that was a subset of the group of people that were being served by the organization. But in the 2 months before I changed jobs, I went to 4 funerals. And I got to the point that and I think all of us did, that you'd walk down the street, you'd be sitting in a restaurant, you'd come into a library, and you'd look at somebody, and you'd be like, they're dying. Because it was so common to us. I mean, you'd look at somebody, and they'd have all the classic wasting syndrome kind of symptoms and everything else. And now, they might not have been dying of AIDS, they could have been dying of cancer, but it was like there was this look that people got when things were starting to go pear-shaped. And you saw it everywhere because there was nothing to stop the disease or slow it down. But AZT also had incredible side effects for people as well, so it was very harsh. And when the triple cocktail first came out, if I remember correctly, it was only effective for there was 35% of people could not take it. And there was a man who almost was the second executive director of SCAN, who was a doc at Hershey, who had been outed and then fired for being both gay and HIV positive. And sued Hershey, and eventually he was known as Dr. X. And Mark was a wonderful man, but he was one of the people that the cocktail didn't work, and I think he died in 95 or 96. But it was a crazy sort of existence because sort of work was one thing, and the rest of my life was completely different. I had two toddlers. Paul was 4 and Sam was 2. So it was just kind of these two pieces of my life didn't really fit together very well. And I was also working crazy hours, so that probably didn't help either. But things were changing, even in that short period of time, because I worked for SCAN from, I think it was January of 1992 till May of 95. And even in that time period, things were really starting to change in terms of people's perceptions of the disease. Maybe it was because with the triple cocktail coming in, it meant that it wasn't quite as scary, even though that took a while to kind of all happen. But maybe it's also that just people were talking about it, people were being more open about this. And the other thing it did, it meant that all sorts of people who had been deeply in the closet couldn't hide anymore. So it changed everything. And all of a sudden people did know people who were gay. Some of them sick, some of them not sick, but partners of someone who was sick, or people who you'd always assumed were good friends, and all of a sudden it'd be like, oh, they're partners. Because you just, if you're not looking for something, you don't see it. So it doesn't, and it was, of course, in the public discourse, it was also pretty much not there either. So there was nothing to reinforce the notion that homosexuality was everywhere. And of course, lesbians have also always been able to be more sort of, I don't know if hidden is right, maybe hidden is the right word, than it is for gay men, because people don't think twice about two women walking closely, talking to each other and, or having a dinner together. You don't even think about it, because best friends have done that forever. Or sisters, or cousins, or, whomever. But for men, it was much harder. And there were lots of people who came out, who were outed. I mean, that was also the period where people were outing other people. And it was cruel, because often that person wasn't ready to be public. So it was that was a huge deal when that happened. I'm trying to think of the actor's name. I'm blanking, but I mean, there were public people who suddenly got outed as gay as well, and for some of them, it ruined their careers. They were done, and I hope it doesn't happen. I suppose it does. I'm sure there is discrimination. I know there is discrimination, but I don't think it's as overt or as deep as it once was. Thank God. But at the same time, Pennsylvania still doesn't have an anti-discrimination ordinance that covers everybody. It makes no sense. Yeah. It makes no sense. So people can still get kicked out of their apartments. Yes, they do. Yes. Yes, I went to all of those meetings. It was both encouraging and discouraging.
Scary, yeah.
Yeah. I was incredibly impressed with people who got up and spoke about themselves and their lives, and who may been saying something in public for the first time. But I was horrified by the sheer number of people who were clearly identifying themselves as people of faith, who were saying horrible things about gay people in public and owning it. It's like, sort of, how can that level of ignorance still pertain? And I have a tendency to forget that, of course, it does. And I'm an optimist, so I want things to get better. I keep hoping things will get better. But that was a slap upside the head, I got to say. And I would say that Carlisle is probably pretty representative of most municipalities. Anywhere in the country, that there's going to be that reservoir of people who still cannot accept difference. And it doesn't help. It doesn't help build community. It doesn't help build neighborhoods to have that be part of someone's mindset, because they're blocking out anybody who's different. Well, look around the planet. I mean, we live in a global society. You're not going to get less isolated. It's not going to happen anymore. I mean, unless you really choose very consciously to be isolated. So that was hard. But I was really proud of Carlisle, because, to be honest with you, if I remember correctly, somebody had reminded me that they tried to pass, a group of people in the borough tried to pass a similar ordinance about 10 years ago, and it never made it even made it to the point of really being considered. So things do change. Yeah. Things do get better. And the fact that so many people stood up and said, this is a good thing. this is really a good thing. This is acknowledging that we're all citizens, and we're all full citizens, and that needs to be taken into account. And people need to be protected so that they cannot be abused by people who are hateful. There's like no downside here. So that's very exciting. And I'll be very interested to see, it's my understanding that there have been no complaints brought to the Human Relations Committee thus far. And the people they recruited were wonderful. Really, really experienced, smart people. So I think they'll handle sort of whatever lands with them, I think will be managed fairly well. But it'll be interesting to see sort of, will something bubble up?
Yeah.
I figure eventually something will, just because. But as far as I know, there hasn't been a peep thus far. So that's one of the good things that has happened. But when SCAN was still in its infancy, it was a different time. It doesn't feel like 1992. It's not that long ago.
Yeah, that seems so recent.
I mean, really? I mean, that's what, 26 years ago? Which isn't that much time, really, especially in terms of social change.
Yeah.
Because normally social change is incredibly slow. And what's happened in terms of the US's acceptance and recognition of the rights of gays and lesbians has happened so fast. I mean, when I was at SCAN, if you had asked me whether gay marriage would ever exist, I would have told you you were crazy. But it's here. And it's great. It's so, abrogating anybody's citizenship is a bad thing for the entire community, but we don't often acknowledge that. I don't think, but it doesn't, it has to hurt us. It can't be good to say that someone is less than. There's just, that means somebody else is taking the position of being more than. That's not so good. So working for SCAN was kind of a crazy thing. We were a pretty tight-knit group because I think everybody else faced the exact same questions and comments and concerns that I did. And there were a certain percentage of people in the male gay community that also didn't really like working with women. So that was a surprise, and it was like, oh. And the fact that I was not only married but also had babies, people found really, not quite the thing to do. Yes, I think only one person referred to me as a breeder, and that was basically as a joke. So, but it was a term that was used for people who were like me, who were working in the whole area of HIV and AIDS. And it was usually a real insult. The person who was teasing me about it was one of our guys who was also a drag queen, so he was very funny. He was great, Brian. But it was a funny combination of many different factors. But for me, having grown up in an incredibly white, very middle class suburb outside of Boston, this was the first time in my life I had stepped outside of the mainstream. And it was, in a weird sort of way, liberating, because you're not the good girl anymore because you're doing this thing. And people would question me people would be confrontational with me all the time about this sort of thing, in mild ways, mostly, but also being at a social occasion where somebody would tell an incredibly homophobic joke. And when I first was working there, it was sort of like, just moved, like, okay, fine, and, move away. But I did get to the point that I would look at somebody and say, do you have any idea how offensive that joke was? Because I was angry about that at one point, and I don't get angry very easily. But it was so tone deaf that somebody would tell me that joke. Really? Really? Why would you do that? So occasionally it was uncomfortable for people because I just stopped backing down, and I stopped being polite about that issue because people were dying. I mean, you can't be in that and not have it change you. But it was actually liberating because it's like all the sort of social convention, normal white woman bullshit. It was like, it's just that. It's bullshit. We are human beings. We all have talents. We all have deficits of one kind or another. But when it comes right down to it, we're all the same. So where did these hierarchies of weirdness come from that said, you're okay, oh, you're not, you know, sort of. And that was even beyond color. That was just gender. So it's like, then it goes from there. So then if you're also, you know, HIV positive and a person of color and female, you know, you were like on the bottom rung of that particular ladder, just because people didn't get it, you know, they didn't understand that what people were trying to come to grips with. And the medical establishment was also a difficult place to be. One of the main HIV/AIDS docs was at Hershey, but Hershey had nobody in their emergency room in those days who spoke Spanish. So one of our caseworkers would get called out at all kinds of god-awful times of the day or night to go to Hershey and be able to translate for somebody. Now, since then, obviously, there's now the online translation services and there's lots of other things. But in those days, that wasn't there yet. And you needed somebody right there. And then, of course, Spanish isn't just Spanish. Because if somebody's from Central America, if they're from Puerto Rico, if they're from Haiti, you know, well, not Haiti, because that's Creole, but in different parts of the world, the words are, especially medical words, are not always exactly the same. So there would be difficulties even with her doing the translation sometimes to try to really, because these are intense and emotional and deep things that people were trying to talk about. So I think it shook up the medical establishment hugely, and in a very positive way, because they needed it, and they had to open their eyes and be able to treat everybody. And I think a lot of people didn't want to, was my sense. But so I was in charge of doing development work, so that meant the AIDS Walk was our primary fundraiser, and I don't have the numbers right offhand, but I think I know we raised each of the walks that I was involved with raised at least $80,000. And people were wonderful. And there were still gay bars downtown. Some of them have gone away because and I was just reading an article, evidently lesbian bars have almost completely disappeared because they've gotten sort of subsumed into other things, which I think is kind of sad. Because everybody likes to be in a room where everybody's just like you once in a while, even if not all the time. It's like being with a group of women rather than in a mixed group can be very silly and a lot of fun in a way that you wouldn't have if there were men in the room. But I thought that was kind of sad. But the bars did this thing for months before the walk. They would have jars on on the bar for people to make contributions. And they'd have drag shows to raise money and all sorts of things to raise money. So it wasn't just the money we raised it wasn't all associated with that day. There had been people raising money for months beforehand. And so, as more and more people became public about their health conditions, of course, that meant more families affected, more friends affected, more classmates, you know, it sort of rippled out. So as people became public about their status, often that meant that there was somebody else who started fundraising because they saw what was happening and because there was so little to do for folks at first, except keep them, you know, trying to keep them to eat and that kind of thing. We had a volunteer who worked at Hershey, and at the Hershey Foods, Hershey Chocolate Company annual meeting, when the board came in, they would have lots of chocolate in people's bags and that kind of things, but as soon as you break open a box, you can't sell it. So he would come after the meeting with like 12, 15 cartons of Hershey chocolate products. It's for the caseworkers to give people because so often people weren't hungry. But sweets, more often, you know, they're calorie dense, so they're really good things. And they were like, eat these peanut butter cups because they've got lots of calories. Eat as many as you want. But the AIDS Walk were a very public way too of saying that you were supporting what was going on. So we had people who would support us but wouldn't walk because it was too public. But they'd write us a check, they'd give us money, they'd do fundraising, that kind of thing, but they wouldn't actually walk. And I don't remember, it's interesting, I don't remember ever having any of the hateful people at any of the walks. I never thought about that before right now. Because in later years, the Pride Festival in Harrisburg had a parade. And a couple of times that when I was working with Planned Parenthood, we marched in the parade because we had a lot of clients who were gay. And there were always the hate people screaming hideous and horrible things at us. My favorite being as I was walking down the street kind of near Harrisburg Hospital, and my son was with me, and this hateful street ministry kind of person goes, "Now here come the babies killers." I was like, "Yes, hi, we're here." But I don't remember that at the walk. It was usually, they were kind of joyous days, which was because we raised a lot of money and people got together. I think that was the other thing, is that there was a lot of company on that day, and that was really an attractive thing for people. And there was a committee of volunteers that did a lot of the work for that.
Mm. And where did the AIDS Walk take place? Was that?
City Island. So we'd start at City Island and then go up the river and then come back down and come to City Island. And usually it was in the pavilion area, kind of near where the ballpark is, though I think it must have been the 93 walk. About 2 weeks before the walk, I got a call from the woman who was in charge of Parks and Rec for the city of Harrisburg. And she called me and she said, "Well, the AIDS Walk has to move." It's like, what? It must have been a week before. It turned out that they were filming part of the movie Major League 2 on City Island, and they didn't think they were going to be done. And we were scheduled to be using a pavilion that was right next to the ballpark, but they didn't want the noise. So they wanted us to move, and it's like, I have literally hundreds of people coming on Saturday to do this. Are you kidding me? And after much back and forth, the city, and I think they got the production company to pump in some money as well. They moved us down to the parking lot, but they rented us tents and chairs and other stuff so that we could actually stage everything. And it all got done, but there was a 24-hour period there where I was ready to kill somebody because it was like, what are we going to do? Where can we go? How can I reach out to all the people who are going? Email was, we had email, but email wasn't like email was still very new. And most people didn't have it, and certainly people didn't have it at home. You know, they had to work, but they didn't have it at home, and cell phones didn't exist. So it was like, how sort of, we don't even know who's coming, so how could we tell people to be somewhere else? We were freaking out. Oh, they also posted signs. So we told everybody that we could think of to tell. I think they announced it I think one of the radio stations also announced it for us, if I remember correctly. And the city put out some sort of a notice as well to help support, but it was crazy. But everybody came, we raised a lot of money, and it went fine. So it was a huge amount of work, but it was great. It was great. So I learned a lot when I was working there, there's no doubt about it. Had never used an Excel spreadsheet before going there. Did learn to love them, but it was a struggle while I learned how to do that. And then the things changed near the end of my time there. Peg Durkers was hired away by the state, and a new executive director was hired, and he turned out to be pretty much an unmitigated disaster because he talked a good game, but he didn't really know what he was doing. And he was very optimistic, but he wasn't practical. And he was a terrible manager. So he basically came very close to running the program and running the agency into the ground. And I can remember around the time I decided it was time for me to move on was when there was some talk about whether or not we'd be getting a paycheck that week. I was like, this is not good. Yeah. I have 2 kids and daycare bills. This can't go on. And I was also just getting fried anyway. So that was when I decided to leave, because he was such a disaster. The worst day being, one of the worst days being the day that the bookkeeper knocked on my door and said, can I talk to you for a few minutes? And I was like, sure. He was a very nice guy. And then he closed my office door, and I thought, that's not a good sign. And it turned out that the executive director had been using restricted monies for unrestricted purposes. And he had just realized it because he was working on our books. Well, as soon as he told me that, I then become essentially a mandated reporter. So I had to go into the executive director and say, if you don't fix it, it's been brought to my knowledge that this is happening. If you do not fix this, I have to report you to the Attorney General's office, and I have to do it very soon. Because it would also be about me.
Yeah.
Because I now had that knowledge. And he, I'll fix it. And he did fix it. But that was like, I'm done. I can't have that. I cannot be in a situation where somebody would be doing something that not only unethical, but also illegal. And apparently not worry about it. It's like, no. I think I had a very stiff drink when I got home that night. But he was just bad at what he was doing. And it can happen to any given, but if it's a really small organization, the impact is really fast. And Durkers had been a phenomenal administrator and had really kept things very tight and very moving and was a really ethical person. So that was bad. So I left then in '95, and things were really starting to change then because the triple cocktail had been put into use. I don't know how early, maybe early '95, late '94, I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and look. So it was an extraordinary experience. And I'm still friends with some people I met from that time, and it was crazy. But it changed me more than any other job that I had ever had. Probably next most would be when I was working for Planned Parenthood. Again, for some of those same reasons, that you're on the fringe, but you're also dealing with seriously life and death issues that affect people's lives in a very immediate way. I mean, if you have an unwanted pregnancy, your life stops, at least for a while you make the decision about what's next. And it's never an easy decision for anybody. And if they choose to have an abortion and move on with their lives, that's probably the best thing for them to do at that time. And to be honest with you, I don't know a single woman who's had an abortion who doesn't think for her it was the right decision at that time. This whole trope about women, I should never have done that, I think is incredible crap. Because I don't think it's true. I mean, it's a hard decision. It's a decision that nobody wants to make. But once you make it, either because you already have children or because it's not a time in your life, you couldn't support a child or whatever. I don't really care what the reason is. Actually, I don't care if a woman has a reason. If it's the wrong time, it's the wrong time. Be done and move on. Because if you're not ready to be a parent, you should not be a parent. But SCAN was that same kind of thing, that it was dealing with things that every bit of money that we raised went into services for people who were sick. And for some of those people, it meant that they stayed alive long enough to be able to take advantage of the triple cocktail, or that the quality of their life was as good as possible for as long as possible. That kind of, you don't know. So it was sort of exciting and terrifying, but amazing and wonderful at the same time. Yeah. So.
That's amazing. Just for the sake of anybody who might watch/read this in the future who doesn't know, could you just talk, I guess I should have asked this first, but what, I mean, you talked a little bit about what SCAN does, but like education, but maybe caseworkers, what they did? Well,
mainly what people were trying to do was trying to figure out a way to help people live longer. And since a fair number of our clients were IV drug users, their systems were already affected by the drug taking. So their immune systems were already in pretty shitty shape before they got infected. So for those folks, it was a real struggle to stay healthy because they were they could be dealing with multiple things as well as their addiction, but maybe they'd had hepatitis, maybe they had hepatitis C. There could have been other whacks to their immune system before HIV. So that they were always in a delicate balance about sort of what meds might work, what meds don't work, and people would try the different kinds of meds, and they were constantly working with their doctors to try to find something like the right formulary that would work for them, because there's also pain and discomfort of various kinds, and trying to create that balance was always difficult. And the meds made people not be hungry. Well, there's only so much body fat that you can lose before you don't have enough body fat to be able to fight an infection. And that's what happened to a lot of people, that they would get something like pneumonia, and they would have no reserves left to be able to fight the infection because of the wasting syndrome that set in between the meds and the not eating, that created a really unhealthy vortex for folks. And so they were stripped down in terms of their immune system. And since people also didn't really understand how HIV and AIDS worked, it was like, what do you do? So there was this constant struggle for docs trying to figure out what somebody could take, not take. Can they actually withstand these? Because these were incredibly powerful medicines. And they didn't know at first sort of how much is enough, how much is too much. So there was always that struggle as well. I know many of the caseworkers told their clients to find marijuana, because often what that would be, if somebody got stoned, they'd get hungry and they'd actually eat. And it's the same thing. One of my sisters had breast cancer. She's fine at the moment, but during the time that she was doing chemo, she basically ate fruit and yogurt, because she had no interest in eating when she was in the chemo. And the HIV meds were similar. I mean, you felt like crap. And eating was like no interest whatsoever. But that creates a very bad situation moving forward, because people lost weight so fast. So the caseworkers would often be trying to help with any kind of medical things, but also there were people who got kicked out of their apartments, got kicked out of their homes. There were parents who basically said, when their kids came out to them, kicked them out. Just kicked them to the curb, which I don't know what it would take to kick one. If one of my kids came home to me and was sick, I don't care what they're sick with, of course I would take care of them. But this was, and they would just kick people out. So there was a homelessness issue as well. So trying to find places for people to live where the landlord knew that the person was HIV positive. And lots of landlords would say no. So they were constantly in a struggle of working with some of the churches really stepped up at that point. And so some of the churches were incredibly helpful in trying to find places for people to be able to live. But they would spend hours on the phone just trying to get somebody settled and safe so that they were housed and warm and fed and not scared about being on the street, because of course being on the street increases your possibilities of getting all kinds of infections, because your exposure and everything else, and probably badly fed and not sleeping. We've come to realize that not sleeping has massive ramifications for people's health, especially if their health is fragile to begin with. So the caseworkers were always trying to get people kind of settled and safe. We're in some place, any place. There were only 2 hospice houses at that point. One in Lancaster, and Hospice of Central Pennsylvania, which is in Harrisburg, had one. I can't remember the name of the one that was in Lancaster. I don't remember, but they were active very early on and took people in when no one was doing very much at all, and gave people a quiet and warm and peaceful place to die, because they'd been kicked out, or their partner literally could not take care of them anymore. Maybe somebody was was literally physically unable to help move someone because they weren't strong enough, or they might have been sick themselves. So those were the only 2 that I knew of, and they were always full, because they were actually willing and able to be able to deal with it. So the caseworkers spent a lot of time, I mean, that was their primary goal. The education people was trying to just educate everybody. I mean, I can see the woman's face who was our educator, and I can't think of her name. But she would speak anywhere, churches, schools, fire halls, anywhere she could actually get somebody to let her in. And she was a very warm person, so that she would come across, she came across as this sort of practical, no muss, no fuss kind of nurse almost aura to her. And she knew her stuff inside and out. So she was often very good at getting people to kind of open their brains a little bit about what was going on. I remember the Unitarian Church in Harrisburg was very, very helpful. St. Stephen's was also, they're Episcopalian. And oh shoot, there's another one that's right there. Pine Street Presbyterian they were feeding people. So it was interesting to see the community start to come together, but it took a while, and it was definitely the religious community, the religious affiliated community stepped up first, which on some levels makes sense. The other thing that happened was that the foundation was then called the Greater Harrisburg Foundation, scored a grant from the feds to do education, but also to support HIV and AIDS education and services. And their board was really of two minds when they went to get the grant. But the foundation really stepped up and provided a lot of money for the small nonprofit organizations dealing with HIV and AIDS at a time when there was very little money to be had. And then at the same time there was the Ryan White Act. So the Ryan White money really made a huge difference in terms of being able to serve people, and that was funded through us. That money came through the Family Health Council, which was the subcontractor for all the Ryan White money, and then they spread it out to we would apply to them. Mm-hmm. So they were the funnel through which that money came, and the Greater Harrisburg Foundation was another set of money that we could get money from them, again for direct services. But it was all very new. And for the Greater Harrisburg Foundation, which was a very conservative organization, to step up and do that, I think had a great deal to do with their executive director, a woman by the name of Janice Black, who sort of saw what was going on and said, we need to do something, because this is bad. And who else is around? And being a community foundation, you're in a position to be able to manage large grants as well, and also to distribute them, because that's what you do. So that was kind of a natural feeder once that was put in place. And those dollars really made a difference for a lot of the programs where people were being fed and housed. But it was a very fractured kind of funding scene for a long time, because again, people just didn't know what was going on. So the education people did a lot of street outreach, both day and night, and she had a small group of volunteers that would go out at night and hand out kits and talk to people and say, come in, because part of it was also, if you're a person of color and poor and a drug addict, and a white woman says to you, come into our agency, how much trust is there? So it took time for that trust to build, and for the word to get out on the street that you could come to SCAN and get assistance, and there was nothing negative about getting there. And the office was located in a shopping center called Klein Village, which was the first shopping center in Harrisburg, right across the street from Harrisburg High School. So the neighborhood is very mixed. Parts of the neighborhood are really nice, parts of it are pretty hardcore, but it was easy to get to because we were on a bus line. We were on a good bus line. So a lot of people could come to us that way. So that made life easier for folks who were right in the city. But in terms of the day-to-day, we worked like any other nonprofit. We had clients, we tried to take care of them, we had lots of volunteers who came in and did all sorts of stuff for us. There was a group called PFLAG, Parents and Friends, Lesbian and Gays. And the PFLAG moms were great, and they would come in all the time to help us with mailings and stuffing envelopes and doing the kits, and anything we needed, they would come in and be helpful. And for a lot of these folks, their lives had been completely turned around, because more often than not, their child had not been out And now all of a sudden they're out and they're ill.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but these women stepped up. They were, and it was more often the moms. The dads, it was harder. But we had several that would come regularly to help with things as well. So they were wonderful people. I can't even imagine how hard that would be. I literally have no idea. I mean, if your kid comes to you and says, not only am I sick, but I'm dying. And there's nothing to be done.
Yeah.
And then the social approbation. I mean, the closest analogy I would think right now would be folks who have children who have addiction issues. And I've noticed just recently that I've seen 2 different obits where people recognized their child's struggle in the obit. Where otherwise it's, died unexpectedly at home, died unexpectedly, that kind of thing. But in 2 that I saw recently, somebody said, that after a long struggle with addiction. And I thought that was so brave, so brave. But it's that kind of breakthrough that we need so that people start to recognize. And it was true with HIV and AIDS as well. I mean, I would read the obits every day because I would know people. And more often than not, nothing was said. But as time went on, people did say things in their obituaries, which again was stunningly brave to be able to do. But it was part of that change point where something goes from being very sotto voce to suddenly being part of the public conversation. Doesn't make it any easier, but it does. You can sort of see the seismic shift that happens when that changes. So other than, I'm trying to think of any other kind of things about, I feel like there's something else that we used to do. There was another event, and now I'm forgetting what it was. There were often drag shows to support the organization. That was pretty regular, but they would do that on their own and then invite us to come, but they would basically just write us a check or bring in the proceeds on the Monday or, that kind of thing. And there'd be small fundraisers, often by church groups or family groups. Somebody would have a birthday party, where they take up a collection and that kind of thing. And people would occasionally just sort of appear on our door and say, here, we did this over the weekend and here's some money. Great. You're so good. But it was a crazy time. It was a crazy time. And people didn't know. I mean, there was so much we were ignorant of in terms of everything about the course of the disease, and for a long time about transmission. How did this all sort of work? And having ignorance and well, it's all ignorance, because even when people are prejudiced, it's mainly about ignorance. But having sort of ignorance from every direction was hard. But the people I encountered were people who cared so much about what they were doing that, yes, it was a job. There's no doubt about that. A paycheck is a good thing. But you don't do that just for the sheer old hell of it all. And obviously there was huge self-selection in terms of who would come to work for someplace like SCAN, as opposed to, I don't know, American Cancer Society or Big Brother, Big Sister, or any other kind of agency. So they were wonderful people.
That's amazing. I can only really think of one more question. Outside of SCAN, I know you mentioned you did some stuff at Planned Parenthood. Was there any other LGBT activism that you ever did through work or volunteering? No, just keeping in touch, sort of keeping in touch with people and supporting the center with a annual contribution, that kind of thing. But part of when I left SCAN, first I was working for the Harrisburg Area Community College Foundation, and then we went out to England for 2 years because my husband was running Dickinson's Norwich program again. So we went back to England again for 2 years. So that sort of broke off connections. You leave town for 2 years, and it's amazing how, especially by that time email was there, but still he was still pretty much at work, not at home.
And you just lose track of people. So I've sort of been able to check back in with a few people that I knew from that time, but not very many. And just kind of going to events occasionally, that kind of thing. So not terribly active other than sort of vocally supportive of the community, because to not be is foolish. I mean, we got one planet. If we don't work together, we are screwed. And anything that we can do to make sure that we are working together is a benefit. So other than that, no, not really. Partially too because of where I've worked, I was always working kind of crazy hours. Just because nonprofits, the idea of a 40-hour work week and working for a small nonprofit is not usually really a good combination. Because things happen and you have to address them, or there's an event, or there's a crisis of some kind, or whatever it is, and if there's work to be done, it's all hands on deck and you get done. So other than that, not so much.
Okay, just last thing, I guess, we'd like to ask if there's just anything you'd like to say about your experiences or messages to people, or...
Well, I have such huge respect for the people I worked with, and for the people who were activists, volunteers at a time when that was really a hard thing to do. And people stepped up and did it anyway. And they helped change the world. I mean, I don't know that people sort of recognized it at that time, but to have these incredibly fearless people get up and self-identify as somebody who was either infected or affected in public, talk to their legislators, talk to municipalities, talk to their churches, talk to their parents. I mean, people stood up in an extraordinary way that was very, very brave. And I don't know that unless you were alive at that time, so had a sense of the zeitgeist, what was going on in the country, to realize how brave those people were, because they risked getting fired, they risked getting kicked out of their apartments, they risked everything, and they still stood up. And I have just immense respect for those people who did that, because they were brave. They really were. And I don't think there's an analogy to it that's close, because even the closest thing, I mean, sort of the opiate in terms of the impact on families, but even that the level of fear attached to people who had HIV was immense. I mean, I was just working there and I got blowback. I can't even imagine to be a patient and to walk into an office, a doctor's office, and have to deal with staff that might be terrified of you. It's bold, it's brave, and it had to be fucking terrifying. But people stood up, and they made a difference. And every time I hear the name Anthony Fauci, who is the current director of the NIH, infectious disease area, he was the guy in the federal government who stood up and said, we have to do something, and we have to do it now. And he took huge heat for it. And he didn't shut up. He just kept talking and talking and talking and making things happen. And every time I see him, he's got to be getting close to retirement, but it's just like, thank you for what you did. But that's what it takes in a situation like this. It takes people who have conscience and who have ethics and morals and say, this is not right. I mean, it's the people who stood up against slavery. It's the people who said women need to have the right to vote. It's those people who put themselves on the front line and say, this is wrong and it has to change. And with this particular situation, it was people taking their lives in their hands. Because people got beat up, people got shot. I mean, people got hurt when they stood up. And gay folks were getting beaten up all the time. I don't know if I hope that's changed, but I mean, at that time, that was a real issue. You know, coming out of a gay bar and there'd be a bunch of yahoos who would beat people up. So I have just the huge respect I have for the people who did stand up and really made a difference for everybody. Because you can't, if you have something that's happening in terms of the arena of public health and you don't pay attention to it, then you put millions of people at risk.
Yeah.
And they did it. So I'll get off my soapbox.
It's a good ending to that.
Well, thank you.